How's it going, guys? John the Basic Expert here, and I wanted to make this video because I've seen a slight uptick, I think, in new viewers here on the channel, and to that I say welcome. I'm glad you're here. But in my last video, I think a lot of people sort of, because they're not familiar with my previous comments, and they're not familiar with things that I previously said, they sort of thought I was maybe setting up a false dichotomy, which is something I saw. They tried to say like, oh, well, one thing I saw or hinted at was, you think that playing rules as written in role-playing are in opposition to each other, and you just want to roll ROLL play instead of role play. And I can see how people come to these conclusions, especially if you're just stepping into my channel for the first time and you're not familiar with my comments or previous content. And maybe you're here because of the recent Kickstarter that I'm currently doing right now, which is Whitebox. You stumbled across that, which means you stumbled across my channel, or maybe you heard someone else talking about it. And so you came to check me out, and you saw what I said, and understandably, you misconstrued what I said. And quite honestly, I don't always express my ideas the best way. Sometimes I can be a little bit too fiery. Sometimes I just sort of assume knowledge, and that's a mistake that I make quite often, is that I do it to my wife all the time too, where I just sort of assume people have the context that I have, and sometimes you need to lay the groundwork, you need to lay the foundation of that context in order to make those statements make sense. So if you're new to this channel, welcome, and I thought it would be high time that I maybe revisit some basic concepts because of that, and sort of lay out the basic experts, my basic sort of manifesto or view or philosophy on gaming. And I think that might put a lot of past comments I made in proper context, and then going forward, it can, if you're new here, it can put anything future that I say in a proper context, right? So that you understand exactly what I'm saying, where I'm coming from. And I think that when we have that, we can have a better discussion about games in general. And I think that's important. So let's dive in to my philosophy on games. So I'm going to start with the most controversial position that I have. And I didn't always hold this position. It's a position that I've come to maybe over the last 2 years. And large in part from interacting with people in the BroSR. I don't know, you don't have to be familiar with who they are, but there are a lot of guys that advocate specifically for playing, at the time at least, a lot of AD&D first edition by the rules. But they really sort of play a lot of different games, and they advocate of playing those games as best as you can by the rules. And I used to be very much in favor of Rule Zero being the first thing that you do. Rule Zero being the end-all be-all tool. It's the tool, the universal tool that fixes everything. And I've since sort of changed my opinion on that, and we'll get to that. But I really believe that the best advice that we can give new gamers, especially people coming into the hobby, is to start by playing games strictly according to the rules, as best as you possibly can, and saying that it's okay to look up a rule in the midst of play as you are learning. I think that your player should be understandable in that regard, understanding of you trying to learn a rule set and game master it. It's a very, it's a very tough thing to do. And so I think that we need to understand how a game is played and how all the various intricate moving parts sort of interact with each other. And I think that in that instance, we can kind of see mistakes in game design. We can see things that maybe we personally do not like, and we understand how they work and the implications of those things. And thus, we can make a change to those rules. We can apply Rule Zero. We can apply GM Fiat. We can apply some sort of homebrew aspect to the rules in order to make them function better. And I think that that's a perfectly legitimate way. Essentially, this is Chesterton's fence, right? That don't move the fence, don't take the fence down unless you understand why the fence is there. I don't think this is a controversial opinion, but a lot of people have taken offense at this position of mine, and that's why I'm starting it here with this first point. But I think that it's important. I don't think that should be a controversial position to take. I don't think that I necessarily have a hyper contra position in a lot of respects here. But all I'm saying is I would advocate for new GMs, people new to the hobby, people that want to try game mastering for the first time, do your best. I mean, you're going to make mistakes, but do your best to play rules as written as best as you can. And maybe do that for a little while, and you will start to see things like, this rule doesn't interact well with this other rule. This is actually not good game design. I'm sure I have things like that in my own games that I have designed, right? That you don't like. But you read them, you tried them, and now you know that you don't like it. And I think that's important. That's all that I would advocate for. The second point, a philosophical point I'd point to in my games, is that player-driven sandbox games. I think the ideal game for me that I love to play in is a sandbox game. So like a wide open world where players are in control of their character. They can choose to go any place they want. They're not beholden to some narrative that the referee has laid down. And I think this does two things. This frees up the referee to being a partner with the players. And it frees up the players to actually having their choices matter. If they want to go and say, hey, what's in the forest at the foot of those mountains? Let's go explore that. They can go do that, and their choice matters. Maybe they discover something there that is really unique, interesting, and pertinent to the game world. Maybe they want to go 20 miles north to the castle and talk to the lord of that castle there, or some merchant there, or whatever. Join a guild. They can do anything they want. They have this whole fantasy world open to them. And that's the most magical, awesome thing as well, is that you're in this fantasy world. What do you do? To me, that's super interesting. And I vastly prefer that over a heavy railroad game. Now, that doesn't mean I won't enjoy a railroad game. I've played in some with friends, and I've ran that kind of game before. And honestly, some rule sets will require that mode of play. They're designed for that mode of play because honestly, that's become the conventional wisdom. That's become the conventional mode of play. But for me personally, I love sandbox games. I love an open world. I love the players being able to explore. And I love that it starts to put the world in motion. And I think this is something that the referee should be doing, is they should be injecting themselves into the world in some respects too. This lord is at war with this lord and they're fighting a battle over here, and the outcome of that might affect the players because now there's this war-torn country that they have to go through, and they got to maybe go around it, or going through it might get them involved in it. And that's contributing to the story just as much, or to the adventure, to the campaign, just as much as the players deciding which direction they want to go, what they want to explore, what guild they want to interact with, what NPC they want to interact with, and what goals and ends they want to pursue. I think that, to me, that's the most fun kind of game, and I love that kind of game. This brings me to my second philosophical point and how I personally advocate and run games. That is low to zero prep. This is something that has become very controversial to many, and a lot of people have a problem with the name or the term, and so let me define it. Zero prep to me is an ideal. You're probably never going to actually get to pure zero prep because there's always going to be that one midwit, that one guy who's going to go, well, actually reading the rules is prep then. Yes, you're right, but you understand the colloquial way in which I'm using the term zero prep. The zero prep is an ideal. It's a goal. You're always striving to be as close to zero prep as possible. You probably will have to make a map. You probably will have to maybe make a dungeon map. You might have to write down some NPC stat blocks. You probably have to read or refresh yourself on a rule. You might have to look up a monster stat block. You might have to roll on some random tables beforehand to figure some things out. But regardless, you're always aiming to minimize your prep. And I think that for me, as a dad and a husband and a pretty busy guy, to me, I don't have time at this point with a 5-year-old daughter and a wife to sit down and prep this awesome 3-act campaign that's going to go from here to here to here, and there's going to be this plot twist here. I maybe got 10 to 20 minutes before the game session to figure out what I'm going to do, or what I think the players want to do, or react to what the players did last session and move that forward in the coming session via the sandbox method, right? And so to me, I feel like I get as good or similar results in this way by just using using rule sets that have tables in them that allow me to engage in this. So I love games like Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition. There's plenty of tables in that. I think Scarlet Heroes by Kevin Crawford has a lot of good tables within that. And I think his World Without Numbers game does as well. I love rule sets. I love tables. I love books of tables that give me the tools, if they're not there as to my liking, in the rule sets themselves. So for instance, BX or Old School Essentials is a little light on its generative tools. So think something like Sandbox Generator or using the AD&D First Edition Dungeon Master's Guide might be something I supplement that with in order to make this low to zero prep game style game possible. And oftentimes it's using these tables, rolling on them, interpreting them, and injecting them into the game in the same manner on the fly, in the same manner that the players are making choices as their characters that drive the adventure forward. So to me, low to zero prep is something that goes hand in hand with the Sandbox game. And I should note with both of these two, I think these are very pertinent to something I really want to start to pursue and advocate for and push forward more. And that's club play. That is I guess you could say something akin to a West Marches game. Although I think that in this regard, time is important. But that brings us to this next point. I think that timekeeping is important in a game. So within these kinds of games, so I've just mentioned that it's low to zero prep, it's a sandbox game, and it's maybe club play. So 0E, for example, says you can have 6 or whatever to 50 people playing in a campaign. How do you manage that many people time-wise? Since they're all playing in the same campaign, how do you avoid time paradoxes? And I think the best way to do that is to have some mode of strict timekeeping. And this is, again, where I have to give credit to the guys in the BroSR, because I think they have the easiest way of doing that, which is just tracking everything onto the real-world calendar. So if it takes 2 weeks for your characters to go to the dungeon and back, adventure in the dungeon and come back, those characters are locked down for 2 weeks. Meaning, if those same players that use those characters come back, if you're playing every week and those players come back a week later, since the game world time is tied to the real world time, those characters are locked down. If they want to play, they have to play as a different group of characters. And so most players will have a stable of characters. But I think that this helps create less anomalies, it encourages downtime, and it encourages, as players level up and maybe get to domain play, they can start to make big moves in the world in the off time. And tying all these things to the real world calendar helps you know how long it's going to take for that player's army to get towards that other player's castle in order to besiege it. Because I do think that PvP at that point is something that's fun and harkens back to the wargame roots of the hobby. So to me, I think that keeping time in some manner is important. Now, you don't have to use, I won't say that you're bad or a bad person if you don't use one-to-one time, in that the real-world calendar syncs up with the game-world calendar. But as long as you're keeping track of time in some respect, I respect you, and I think that you're going to be able to unlock a lot of really cool elements to your game that just sort of hand-waving time won't offer you. This brings me to another point. I think that rules and agency matter. So rules matter because they define how the game is meant to be played, and that's going to determine what kind of game you're going to play. So for example, I think that the way that 0E or AD&D tells you to play the game is going to produce a different kind of game than, say, RuneQuest or Pendragon or Harn is going to tell you to play a game. And this is important because that's ultimately why you would choose to play Harn, let's say, over D&D, or you would choose to play RuneQuest over D&D, or you would choose to play D&D over Dragonbane, or something like that, right? I think that rules matter. That's what differentiates these games, and it's not just like resolution methods, but a lot of these games have rules within them that inform the world and how it's played. And I think a perfect example of that, for instance, is The One Ring. The One Ring is a game that's Lord of the Rings, and it plays very different from, let's say, D&D, right? There's lots of elements and rules in that game that, if you're using those rules, they're going to push the players and the world in a different direction that's in the style and spirit of what Tolkien wrote, as opposed to the more pure pulpy style that D&D is trying to get you towards, right? So I do think that rules matter, and this leads back to the first point, where I think plain rules as written will sort of inform the kind of game world that the rules are trying to guide you to, and that right there can help you decide whether you want to play that game or not, whether you want to use that game world or not. But I also think that it might help you figure out a way, and I've seen a lot of people do this, where they'll go, I want to use Mithras, but I want to put it in the Dragonlance world, right? I know the Black Lodge Games guys have done this, where, they'll take they took the Mithras system and wanted to do Dragonlance in that. And I think that once you understand the rule set and then you've read, you understand the Dragonlance world, obviously that's probably possible. And it might be really interesting and cool and provide a different flavor and way of doing that. So you can kind of start to see, once you understand what the rules are guiding you towards, other disparate rule sets that actually in theme might be relevant to each other and you can borrow from and actually start to mix and match, and you'll do it in a more masterful way because you understand how those rules would interplay with each other and how those resolution methods and the spirit of the game, the world that it's trying to guide you towards, what those things are. This brings me to another point in my philosophical, I'll say, point of view here, that role-playing and rules as written are not in opposition. I see this a lot, and I've seen this in my comment section, and people want to set up this false dichotomy that because they'll make this assumption about me, that because I advocate for rules as written, I'm against role-playing. And I think they set up this false view that you can't role-play and play rules as written. And I think that that's actually the opposite. I think, again, as we've discussed, since rules inform the kind of world that you're creating, again, think the One Ring, for example. It's really trying to push you into adventuring in Middle Earth and being honest and true to the world that Tolkien created, the cultures there, and the sort of moral, ethical, spiritual expectations that would be in that game world. The rules inform that and thus inform how you would role play in that world. And when you're playing the One Ring, like, how would you play as an elf in that game? That's going to be different than how you would role play an elf in, say, your generic D&D game or in Palladium Fantasy, maybe, right? There's going to be some differences there. So I think that that's important. And I think that the two are not actually diametrically opposed. I think it's a false dialectic in that response, in that way. But I do think that the two can work in hand, and I'm not opposed to that. That also leads to this other point. I think a lot of people think because I advocate for the Sandbox game, and because I like that mode of play, and I like rules as written, or at least to the best of my ability, I like to try and do that I'm against story. And I'm not against story. I'm against a pre-planned story that you force the players to go down. I am obviously, and as I said, in favor of a story sort of organically emerging through play, through the choices the players made. The players chose that instead of joining with the feudal lord over here and dealing with this war with this other feudal lord over here, they're going to go explore the woods over here. But hey, once they come back out, that war that they didn't get involved in has now spilled out over to here in this area, and it's affected them in this area here. And, that to me is a breeding ground for story. It's just that I'm getting to story in a different way than maybe conventional wisdom tells you to get get to the story. They tell you to get to the story before you play the game, prep it all out, lay it all out, at least as best as you can, and then play it. Whereas I'm saying, no, we're going to play and discover what the story is. I don't know if that makes sense. You can like it or dislike it. That's fine. A lot of people do. But I'm just trying to explain what my sort of philosophical perspective is on running the game. And that leads me to the problem of conventional wisdom. I want to challenge the idea that good role-playing requires heavy GM fiat or extensive prep or long backstories. These trends, I think, often lead to having everything put on the GM's shoulders, and this leads to GM burnout. I was there, I'm sure you've been there. And I just sort of want to advocate for a mode of play that is hearkening back to something that's older too. That this is a perfectly legitimate way to play, just like how the people advocating for you to do a high prep adventure or, run a module and run your players through it in this, linear sense on this linear adventure. And I understand that a lot of players like that and a lot of GMs like that as well. But I just think that there needs to be more voices in the hobby that are advocating for maybe another way to play, maybe another way to look at the game. And that this is linked back to the wargame roots of the hobby, as I've already discussed. The Sandbox game, players making choices and acting on those choices, acting on those goals. And that those goals and choices don't have to be something where the referee is sort of dungeon master, the game master, is trying to guide you back onto their rails or guide you back onto the narrative that they constructed, that they see where you're going, the referee sees where you're going, they adjudicate that, and they implement their own little twists into that and into what you're doing, into the game world. That makes sense. And I think that that's super interesting, and I think there just needs to be more voices that say that sort of thing. And so that's always been the goal of my channel. That's partly what, first of all, first ever brought me into looking into old school games. Was I was running a lot of high prep 5th edition games. I was running Call of Cthulhu, and actually one of the most successful campaigns I ever ran was a very high prep Call of Cthulhu investigation over the course of like a year or almost a year. It was super fun. Players loved it. We had a great time. Lots of good memories made there, but it was very taxing on me as a referee and as a game master when I did that. And it was very taxing on me as a 5e GM as well. And I had great players that went along with that stuff, but my players have gone along with this new way that I want to play as well, and they seem at least to be all for it and enjoying it. And I just sort of want to talk about that. I sort of want to really advocate for that and say, hey, this mode of play is also an option. You can also do this. This is also possible, and you can have a lot of fun doing it as well too. So that's going to do it for this video, guys. I hope that you enjoy it. I hope it, if you're new to the channel, my hope is that you sort of see where I'm coming from, and maybe some past statements you've seen me say, if you're new to the channel, like especially in last week's video, maybe they make more sense to you now, I hope. It's just that, I actually realized when I sat down to make this video, or I was looking at my comment section this morning, and I was like, I haven't done a video like this in a while. I don't know if I've ever actually done a video like this. I've always just sort of picked a different disparate aspects of my philosophy and talked about them. And sometimes maybe I've done this on stream, but I stream for 2 hours on Wednesdays, and not everyone has the time to sit and listen to someone blabber for 2 hours, or a group of friends blabber for 2 hours on a show. And so I just thought it'd be beneficial to lay out my philosophy, lay out my perspective on how I run games, what I think a good game is, what I think a game ought to be, or what a game should be. And, just sort of throw that out there, that this is an option, this is a way to play, this is a totally legitimate way to play, and it actually has roots going back all the way to the beginning of the hobby via the wargaming roots. I mean, Zero ED&D called itself a war game on the cover of the books themselves. So that's going to do it for this video, guys. If you like this kind of content, like, subscribe, share the video. If you want to support the channel, you can do so on Patreon. You get videos early, and as well as other goodies and items like that. You can support on my Guilded server or right here on YouTube. Make sure you check out Whitebox, which is my Zero E plus chainmail clone that is currently 100% funded on Kickstarter. It's past 100% funded, and we still got a number of days to go, so you can still get in and get a pledge in if you're interested in getting something that harkens back to old school play and presents it in an old school way. I'm making a box set that has dice, character sheets, 3 little booklets, and a wilderness game board for you to use as well. So that's going to do it for this video, guys. Thank you for checking out this content. And again, I hope that it helps to illuminate at least my perspective, where I'm coming from, and maybe gives some of my comments that I've made a bit more context for you to understand that. Anyways, I hope you have great games. I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out.